Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the latest collaboration between KZ and Hawaii Bad Boy called the PR2. So the PR2 isn't their second planar. I think it's probably their third or fourth one. So there was a PLA 13, a PR1, a PR1 Pro, and now we have the PR2. So the shell itself, what's to notice is that the back, I don't think is actually open back. I think there is a resin cover that's actually underneath it, and I don't think that actually is open back, although they use this decorative mesh on the back and they use it on the sides here. But there you go, there is the Hawaii Bad Boy logo and KZ HBB PR2. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on what's in the box, what the cable looks like. All that stuff is things that you've seen before. So let's talk about things that you have not seen before, and this is sort of PR2 against PR1 Pro and Heyday'd. And for me, a lot of what sets PR2 apart is the pin area right here. How it's above PR1 Pro, how it's well above Heyday'd. And for me, this is almost a defining characteristic of PR2. So the energy that was out here in PR1 Pro, that blue line, that upper treble energy, which is sort of planar, typical, rolled back down to where Heyday'd was, and that is one of the defining characteristics of Heyday'd. So perfect dropping of that upper treble energy down to where Heyday'd is, but then bumping up the pin area, which is not really like Heyday'd. Heyday'd is actually down here. Even PR1 Pro is sort of in between the two. And bass wise, it's kind of a mix. I think it's above Heyday'd and sort of crosses over where PR1 Pro. But for me, sort of this added emphasis of right here in the pin area is actually different than both of those two sets and sort of sets it apart. It's a different sound, and you'll probably look at it and say, well, it looks like 100 other IEMs that I've heard. It's got this nice bass shelf and it's got this nice elevated pin area, and maybe that's a hair above 10 dB, but that's very typical. And then it kind of arcs over. Like I've seen that before in lots of IEMs, and I think that's the point. Is it's a planar that's actually tuned to be a little more similar to traditional IEMs, and this makes it a very easy transition into planar world because they've set the price really low, and we'll get to that right now. So I think above all else, everything else on the sheet, if the only thing you read is the first thing, I think that is what most people are very much interested in. It's that full planar experience at $40 and tuned with a safe, generally appealing tuning by Hawaii Bad Boy. And you could pretty much stop right there, period. That's enough for most people to take the plunge on PR2, and rightfully so. I think that is the highlight of this set. He basically brought back the promotional pricing from PR1 Pro, which lasted, I think, about 7 days. That first 7 days where if you would purchase the PR1 Hi-Fi, and then they expanded it out to almost anyone could purchase PR1 Pro at $40 or $40, whatever it was half price. And now to basically allow everyone, a much wider chance to have a full planar experience of $40 is very, very important, and sort of happy that lots of people are diving in simply for that point, even without reviews. I think it's worthy enough that, that price is going to attract lots of people. So the second part of that, is it better than PR1 Pro? And I will say it depends. And I have PR1 Pro, and I like PR1 Pro. And I will say, if you are a treble head and you really like that upper treble energy that PR1 Pro did, and you're really a detail-seeking person in that range, I think I would stick to PR1 Pro. If you're more mid-centric detail seeker, you like to hear those details right in the mids, I think PR2 is probably better in your line, especially if you're not as tolerant to that upper treble energy. I think of PR1 Pro, I think PR2 is definitely going to hit you in a much better spot. For me, I think, where I started out with planars and with timeless and those kind of sets, I think that upper treble energy is something that I was attracted to because it's something that you really couldn't get on a one dynamic driver. So I tended to really enjoy those sets for that reason, that upper treble energy. So when it was rolled back into Heyday'd and it was sort of more natural, I sort of knew that was going to be the way going forward because it doesn't really sacrifice all that much detail, but it makes it much easier listen for people who were buying into planars for the first time. And that's sort of exactly where PR2 was, or PR2 sits. PR1 Pro is still going to be like those timeless guys, and even the S12 original guys who really like that upper treble energy, that's what PR1 Pro does well. So when should you stop and think before buying it? As I said, you should buy it anyway, but when should you stop and think? If you really only have a phone for your music source. Like most planars, this one needs a lot of power to sound good, but this one needs a lot of volume headroom as well. And it's just kind of odd to me that it was actually the hardest one to drive. If you look at the sensitivity ratings, PR1 Pro actually, KZ changed the driver slightly to make it easier to drive over PR1, and now PR2 is actually harder to drive than the first of the other two. So yeah, kind of interesting that it ended up being a little harder to drive, and it literally does take a lot of volume to get you there. So do be aware of that if you are going to run that on your phone. Burn-in required. I will say that let your brain adjust to planar levels and intensity. And I think even Hawaii Bad Boy mentioned this in his video. If you are a first-time planar purchaser, there is an intensity to that treble, whether it's in the pinna gain or in the upper treble area. There is a level to it and an intensity that you have to get used to. You could certainly burn it in for 200 hours, but that intensity is still going to be there. So I wasn't a huge fan of the foam tips that they include. It's kind of a big maybe. For me, they were just smallish. And this one does need, again, a very great seal inside your ear to sound right. So did HBB heyday the PR1? I think yes and no. I think, as we sort of talked about, I think there is that upper treble part. He shifted that upper treble energy down, which gives you a similar heyday upper treble, which is more natural. And again, I will say it set the bar again. I said the same thing about Heyday, is it's going to be really hard to go backwards to where the original S12 was and where Timeless was, with that sort of that raw, super detailed, almost a tizziness, planar timbre, version of treble. Heyday really shifted that towards a more natural sound. That's exactly what I said about that in that review. And PR2 does the same thing. So now you have almost a $200 set and a $40 set doing that upper treble region in a very similar way. So I do think it's going to be very hard for other brands to really, revert back to a more raw version of treble, or one with more planar timbre, after he kind of set the bar with PR2. What's a little different about from Heyday is, as your first planar, I think this one is easier to digest version of planar intensity, mostly because he dropped that upper treble, but the emphasis on the upper mids for planar details instead of being in the upper treble. So like I said, I think this bump for PR2 is not the same as what it sounds like on Heyday, and it's actually one of my favorite parts of Heyday, and that's the only reason why I put that on the paper. But yeah, this little area of emphasis doesn't exist on Heyday. Heyday is very balanced, very smooth. This is a very relaxed version, so this doesn't get in your way of hearing everything that's all the way out here. Very balanced, hearing out to the horizon of you're hearing on upper treble. I love the way Heyday actually did that. So to put a little bump in here for PR2, I think I noticed it, especially if you turned it up in volume, it was noticeable. So I will say that's not quite like Heyday, but rolling back the mid bass for a more neutral sound, the way he rolled back the way PR1 is a little bit more mid bassy than PR2, and I sort of 100% agree with that, because he dropped the amount of energy out here, has some energy here for detail. I think this does, dropping it really back, just allow you a little more detail in here without having to bump this up even more, or having to bump this up even more. Just clean this out, make everything a little more, easier to hear detail-wise and resolution-wise. I actually kind of agree with that move. And whether you agree that's what he did on Heyday versus the original OG Woo, and that made it a little less fun, I think I sort of disagree with that. I think that more neutral sound works really well on planars. So sound-wise, so where PR1 was similar to that super detailed, slightly raw, timeless sound, PR2 definitely has a less raw sound, like we were talking about, that especially that upper treble, so noticeable on the original planars. less raw, more controlled, less over boosted air, just less planar sounding from those original first group, and it's going to be a much easier, better first planar for most people, just because it closely, it's closer resembling to more IAMs that you're used to. And, if you're familiar with HBB reviews, it's not all that surprising that he opted for that more natural upper treble, because that's really what made Heyday stand out from the pack at the time it came out. So bass, I will say the same thing. I think out of the box it was leaner and brighter. You have to let your brain adjust to it and get the right tips for it. Definitely find tips that let you that fit right. Let your brain adjust to it, and it actually settles in the same way that Heyday does. And people have said the same thing about Heyday. It's a little too lean, not really too bright, but it was a little bit too lean. And I think after you just find the right tips, find the right source, I think they both settle in the same way, and you end up with a very nice, almost neutral mid bass, which doesn't mean no mid bass. It just means that there isn't a really heavy, bloating or boominess to the mid bass. It's sort of right there in line, doesn't step out. Very, very nice. And I think the genres would even be similar to Heyday. It's just less of a banger brother to PR1 Pro, and for me, it's the same thing about Heyday. It's really a taste of what more expensive sets offer, right? That balanced, more neutral mid bass is something that you find in more expensive sets. Getting it at $40, even getting it at $200 is, a real kind of taste of what really more expensive sets sound like, higher up into mid-fi and kilobuck sets. So, but on the other hand, if you do put on a track like Deadmau5's The Veldt, it does thump the way a planar should, and it's almost worth your $40 to hear planar bass that's not too lean, kind of like Dioko or Talos. Those guys kind of messed up the mid bass a little bit, went a little bit too lean, but it's also your $40 chance to decide if you really want to purchase more pricier sets that will no doubt be out at the rest of the year. The mids, again, I think the focus here, like most planars, there's that upper mid intensity, and whether it's PR2 or other sets, they all have an intensity there. That's what was a little bit different about Heyday, and that's kind of why I talked about that. This one, lost a bit of the PR1 planar tech wow. I think a lot of that wow happened in the upper treble and the amount of detail that upper treble kind of forced into your face. I think that's what a lot of the original planars did as well. So it lost a little bit of that, but what you gained is a more general appealing tuning. And at $40, that's just the right sound. And I can't really disagree with that move. I think there is still quite a bit of a gap between KZ's one dynamic drivers and the planar mids that you get here. So don't think there isn't much to gain from PR2. There is. It's just the difference between how Heyday did it and how PR2 did it is a little bit different, and how PR1 Pro did it. So those upper mids are energetic. They will get a bit bright on some tracks, but turn down the volume about one notch, and usually it's much better and more natural. And for me, this was pretty much everything on PR2, was figuring out what volume. And there's a point at which if your volume is too low, it sounds a tad recessed. Right in the middle, it sounds very natural. And if you click one notch too high, it sounds, shouty, kind of a little bit overdriven is what it sounds like. And I spent, almost on a per track basis, really playing with the volume to really, on those quieter acoustic tracks, you'll turn it up so you can hear all that planar detail. On more energetic tracks, I'll turn it back down. And the Veldt was actually one of those tracks that you just listen to his voice. You listen to that vocal, and you could hear it go from slightly back to perfectly natural to that sounds a little bit too overdriven. So yeah, I had my hand on the volume quite a bit on this one for that pinna area. Treble wise, I think there is more energy in that lower, like we talked about. The relaxed upper to sound less planar, and I think that just works. It just match it to your preferences. If you are an upper treble guy, then that's probably not going to work for you, but for the most part, for most people, I think it is actually going to work. If you like that upper treble, PR1 Pro is more in line with that. This one's tuned for really everyone else who likes that more neutral upper treble, and it isn't really over boosted so it can be heard. And I'll say PR1 Pro sounds more like a fun KZ. It's sort of that more V-shaped. There's a lot of energy out there in the upper treble. PR2 is very much into HBB's preference of no distractions, right? Bring those levels down so guitars and snares and cymbals aren't over energetic, don't pop out of place. That's exactly kind of what you're getting on not only PR2, but I think Heyday was very much along the same lines of no distractions. Stage, I think everything is in place for a nice stage on this one. Planar, quick, mid bass. It's not clouding up, not veiling anything. Kind of hits and gets out of the way. Just kind of a nice big open planar stage as you would expect. Energetic mids with nice planar detail and resolution. Enough treble energy to expand the image. Like most of what PR2 does, none of it is all that revolutionary, but it's tweaked to be, for a larger audience, not for the people who got into Timeless and can tolerate that much treble, or even the original S12. It was a special set, but this PR2 kind of brings you into the realm of sounding like more traditional sets and less intense and less levels and all these other things that really popped out of place on previous planars. Now we're kind of back into planars showing off what they can do within levels that are going to be general appealing. So that is pretty much the sweet spot of PR2. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.